The man threw his daughter through the fire as if she were a sack of rotten potatoes that he wanted to throw out of his life forever. Clara stood still, the night wind from the prairie blowing her old dusty dress. The flickering light from the firewood fell on her thin face, where every line, every freckle, every fold from hunger and humiliation was considered ugly by the world. But her eyes had no tears. There was no more water to cry. The humiliation, the anger had long since drained away. Her father, a man with eyes as silver as rusty knives, spoke as if he were peddling a lame mule in the marketplace. This little one doesn't complain. She's hungry, and she's strong. I have 5 mouths to feed. Across from him, Taza, a quiet Apache, nodded, tossing a bundle of animal hides and a pair of old horseshoes to the ground. No one asked her if she agreed. Clara did not scream, did not beg, did not struggle. But inside her, the fire of anger began to burn, ignited by her father's last words. At least someone will take it. Take her away. Not a daughter, not a person, just a commodity. And the world around him joined in, silently complicit. The father, the townspeople, the little brothers who imitated her with contempt. Everyone thought she is ugly and therefore not lovable. She is different and therefore not worthy of living like normal people. She walked toward the horse like a shadow, but not a bowed shadow, but a shadow about to rise. Clara didn't know how Taza would treat her, but she knew one thing for sure. If she lived, she wouldn't let anyone else trample on her values. And if anyone tried, she would fight. With her mangled hands, her nails, her teeth, with every last breath. Like now, the fire behind her burned brightly, but in Clara's heart, the fire of resentment burned even brighter, burning away all memories of her old home, of the days when she waited to be loved. She did not wait any longer. Fires flickered in the open plains south of Deadbrush, where horse trading trips were often conducted quietly after dusk. Men stood in a circle around the burning logs, their cowboy hats pulled low, their faces mostly in shadow, leaving only eyes as cold as steel on flint. And in the circle of fire, their daughters, their goods were spoken of as this, that goods, as if their flesh and souls were worth less than a set of horseshoes. Clara stood in the midst of them, unshaken, unmoving, but within her was a stormy ocean. She had heard whispers that ugly women should be Indian wives, as if that were the worst punishment for any white girl. The men around the fire made no attempt to hide the contempt in their voices, as if she had no ears, no mind, nothing but a sick horse to be bargained for. Taza, the Apache leader, stood still, saying nothing. But the look he gave Clara was not that of someone coming to pick out a piece of merchandise. It was the look of someone who had seen too many broken lives, a silent reminder that her pain was not new to this land. And perhaps that was why he asked nothing, said nothing, just handed her a blanket, no pressure, no enticement. But Clara felt no consolation. The pain of betrayal by her own flesh and blood had left a deep wound that would not heal easily. She remembered the way the women in town looked at her, a look of half pity, half joy, that at least they had not been sold. She remembered the furtive laughter of the children calling her crow-faced white Indian. The whole town, the whole small world had agreed on Clara's verdict. Ugly meant useless, and useless was not worth keeping. Clara knew this injustice was not just her problem. It was a disease that ran deep in the fabric of the West, where women had no voice, where Indians were called animals, where the poor were always potential criminals in the eyes of the federal soldiers. And in the midst of that chaos, she, an unpopular white girl, was considered the lowest of both worlds. But it was also in this campfire scene that Clara understood one thing for the first time. The real enemy is not the Apache. The enemy is the world that has taught men to treat women as commodities and taught women to accept that fate without protest. She clutched the blanket Taza had given her, not for warmth, but to remember tonight she was no longer the one being traded. She was the one starting to resist. They left the campfire while the night was still thick as a rainy mud. Clara sat behind Taza on the horse, the rough blanket Taza had held out to her shoulders. The horse walked slowly across the cold meadow, the sound of its hooves mixed with the wind howling from the distant mountains, and in the darkness she waited, waiting for a shout, a tug, a rough hand, because she had been taught that if a man didn't abandon her, he must possess her. But Taza remained silent. He did not touch her. He did not ask questions. He did not even turn his head. He simply rode ahead as if he were escorting his passenger home and not the merchandise he had just bartered for in fur. And it was this silence, no shouting, no threats, no contempt, that made Clara tremble with anger. Angry at the world for making her believe that being beaten was normal. Angry that simple kindness made her feel small and doubtful. The first night they camped under the old cypress tree, Taza lit a fire and silently handed her a small package. Inside were roasted corn and a piece of dried venison. Don't look at her. Don't ask for anything. Just give and turn away. Clara ate silently, chewing each bite as if fighting the thought. Kindness is a trap. Kindness is a lie. She searched for a weakness, something to confirm her fears. But all Taza did was sit on the other side of the fire, wiping away the arrows, head bowed, shoulders straight, as if carrying the tribe and the silence of the world on his back. The next morning when she woke up, the blanket was pulled closer to her, and there was a small leather bag beside her clean water. When Clara fumbled to say thank you, Taza just nodded. No smile, no praise. And with each silent gesture, he inadvertently rekindled in her an emotion more dangerous than anger, hope. Hoping that maybe, just maybe, gentleness didn't always come with claws. And that was what confused her. Because if Taza was really kind, then the whole world, she knew the world that called him barbaric, animal, dangerous, was a lie. And if the world had lied to her about one thing, then perhaps it had lied about everything. Clara doesn't know exactly when everything changed, only that one day while crossing a cold, rocky stream and nearly slipping, it was she who regained her balance, without anyone helping her. The legs that once trembled with fear and resignation were now steadier. The hands that once covered their faces when someone shouted now knew how to build tents, light fires, and butcher hares. And in the eyes that once looked down whenever someone looked, there was now a fire. Not the fire of hatred, but the fire that burned in the hearts of those who had suffered enough and decided never to suffer again. Taza didn't teach her with words, but with silence. He didn't tell her to be strong. He just lived as if she was strong, and that forced Clara to catch up with the way he saw her. The first time she caught a quail by herself, Taza's eyes only nodded slightly, but Clara clearly saw in his gaze something like, "I knew you could do it from the beginning." The first time she reacted when another Apache man taunted her with contempt, Clara did not turn away. She stepped forward, shoulders square, eyes straight, and spoke in English, mixed with learned Apache words. "I am not something you can show mercy to. I do not need anyone's permission to stand here." Taza did not interfere. He just stood close like a shadow behind her, letting her know she is not alone. But she does not need anyone's help. Clara began to understand that the anger in her heart was not a burden, it was fuel. Anger at being rejected, at believing she was unlovable, at thinking that if she wasn't beautiful, she didn't deserve respect. Now that anger gave her a spine. It gave her a voice, and strangely from among the angry fragments, love emerged, not loudly, not poetically. Just every time she saw Taza cleaning a stranger's wound, teaching her how to identify poisonous leaves, or tying a broken bowstring for an Apache child, Clara felt her heart calm down like a lake after a storm. She loved him not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had finally found someone worthy of standing beside her. No higher, no lower. And when night fell, as they sat by the fire back to back, hands gently stroking a newly treated deerskin, Clara knew. The father who sold her no longer had the right to call her his daughter. The town that despised her no longer had the right to call her one of their own, because now she was theirs. Clara had thought she had overcome her anger, that when love was found, forgiveness would come like a gentle rain that would wash away the past. But as Ruth sat huddled on the ground shaking with her gun screaming, "Don't touch me, you savage!" when Taza had only reached out to help Clara realize some angers cannot be extinguished. They must be released. Taza stood still as the soldiers came. No weapons drawn, no resistance, and they still bound him like a wild animal. His arms tied behind his back with horsehide straps, as if he had killed someone, not saved the life of a white woman they had abandoned in the wilderness. "Stop, you red savage!" a soldier roared as Clara advanced. She reacted instinctively. "He is not a prisoner. He is a man." A thunderous slap landed on Clara's cheek, stunning her. "Back off, miss. Don't let him fool you with his barbarian kindness." And in that moment, Clara understood that her old world where laws were written with guns and civilization was a cover for bigotry was never meant for someone like Taza or someone like her. Clara looked at Ruth neatly, bandaged drinking tea by the soldier's fire, and remembered the horror in her eyes as she approached. You went with him. You betrayed your own people. Betrayed? No, she didn't rebel. It's just that for the first time she chose the right side. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She crawled into the tent where Taza was held, her head bowed, her voice shaking not with fear but with anger. I shouldn't have brought you here. I thought they would listen. I was wrong. Taza didn't complain. He just said I needed to see it with my own eyes, not from your mouth. And it was then that Clara knew. If she turned her back, if she let them take her back, wipe the dirt off her, put her back in her white dress, sit at the table with the men talking about order and law, then she would be no different from the father who had sold her. The next morning she walked into the main camp, her hands shaking but her eyes shining like knives. I love the man you are tying up. If you want to imprison someone, imprison me too. If not, release him. No one answered. There was only silence, the silence that weighed like a stone over a corrupt system. And from that silence, Clara knew she had just fired. Not just for love, but for all that was right. Clara's story isn't over yet. If you feel your heart is as fiery as the fire she carries within, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes about justice, love, and unyielding souls. Which side will you stand on when the line between civilization and humanity becomes blurred? The night in the barracks fell like a black curtain, no rustling wind, no howling wolves, just a gloomy silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. And in that silence, Clara moved, not from an ugly girl sold like rags, but to become a rebel firebearer. Taza was tied up in the tent, his eyes still calm, as if he knew everything. He did not moan, did not beg. That made Clara's blood boil even more. She had lived her whole life to please people who never found her beautiful enough, good enough, belonging enough. Now the only person who saw her worth was shackled with the cold iron of a cowardly civilization. She didn't ask anyone's opinion. She didn't wait for a miracle. She acted. Hiding in the supply depot, Clara found a blunt axe rope, a small knife, and a set of old keys thrown in a corner of the bushes. Then slipping through the darkness between the tents of soldiers who slept like drunkards, Clara walked like a woman with nothing to lose. Not because she was brave, but because she was too angry to be afraid. She cut the zipper of the tent and stepped inside. Taza raised his head, his eyes not surprised, just silent, as if he had known she would return. If we run, they will chase us, he whispered. Clara replied, her voice as cold as red-hot steel. Then let them come, but this time I don't run to live. I run to live right. She cut the rope, pulled him up. They did not run like scurrying rats. They retreated like warriors. And when they reached the edge of the camp through the wooden fence, Clara turned back, not to say goodbye, but to despise the world that had chewed away at her dignity. No one chased, no one discovered. Not because they despised her, but because they never imagined that an ugly girl sold as leftovers could rebel. Clara and Taza walked through the woods uphill, blood dripping from her hands where the rope had cut them, but she felt nothing but alive, truly alive, no longer being made for her, no longer a commodity. For the first time in her life, Clara was the one who chose. They came at dawn, just as the hillside was being painted yellow. 5 horsemen, a woman, and an order wrapped in law, but bleeding from head to foot. The smoke from last night's fires still smoldered in the earth when Clara stood by the fire, her hair disheveled, her hands still bleeding from the escape. Taza was gathering firewood near the stream, as quiet as every morning, and her old aunt was grinding herbs under the thatched roof of the hut. The piece was as thin as oil paper, and it was torn apart by the first hoofbeats from the mountainside. Clara looked up. They were coming. 5 men rode their breastplates streaked with silver, their long guns slung across their waists. At the head of the line was Captain Marsh, his mustache as gray as dry sand, his eyes as uncertain as ever. Beside him stood Ruth, her arm wrapped in white bandages, her mouth pursed like a thread about to snap. Clara doesn't run. She stepped out, her feet bare on the gravel, her head held high. She was no longer the girl who had been sold to a red savage. No longer the girl who whispered apologies. She was the one who had chosen to stand on the right side, and now she would not back down. Captain Marsh drew back his horse, stopping about 20 paces from them. He held out his hand, signaling, "Give him up, my men have orders." His voice was not loud, but thick with contempt, as if simply breathing the same air as Taza was an insult to his uniform. Clara did not answer immediately. She took a breath, blood pounding in her ears, her heart beating not with fear, but with the rage roaring in her chest. Then she took another step, standing between Taza and the men with guns aimed. "He's my husband." She said each word like a sledgehammer, hitting the system that had treated her as a commodity. The whole squad was stunned. Even Ruth was frozen, her lips parted, but no words came out. Only Taza stood behind Clara, still as silent as a rock. But his eyes for the first time were on the verge of tears. "No wedding, no father to witness," a soldier shouted. Clara turned her head, her eyes like two torches. "I don't need the permission of the man who sold me. I chose him. And if you want to take him, you'll have to shoot me first." Captain Marsh gritted his teeth and gripped the butt of his gun. But from the back row, a young soldier spoke up, his voice shaking but clear. "They didn't hurt anyone, sir. They just wanted to be left alone." The wind blew, carrying with it the crackling of the fire. And in that silence, the old world began to crack. The storm eventually passed, like all the storms before it, slow, fierce, and leaving behind a painfully clear sky. Clara and Taza were not captured. They were not killed, nor were they forgiven, simply because they did not need the forgiveness of those who had once determined their lives. They left the edge of town, crossed dead grass, climbed steep cliffs, and finally stopped by a stream that snaked through a ravine, a place where the land was colorless, where no one could command love. There, amid the wind whistling through the cliffs and the smell of sage rising from the earth, Clara finally found herself. Not in the mirror had only reflected the hatred others had put into her mind, but in the calloused hands learning to weave baskets, in the steady breathing of her heart as she walked up the mountainside, in the eyes of the Apache children who called her sister and pressed bunches of purple wildflowers into her hands. Clara no longer tries to be loved. She is loved because she is herself. Taza was still as quiet as ever, but now the silence was no longer frightening. It was a trusting silence, like the sound of the earth resting after a season of sowing. When he wiped his brow after a day of hunting, she handed him a waterskin. When she wove a fishing net, he sat beside her, untangling the knots with hands that had been accustomed to bows and arrows, now learned to be gentle. Neither of them mentioned wedding. It was unnecessary. She declared before the guns and power of a cavalry that he was her husband. That love no need for the law to acknowledge, only needed their hearts not to retreat. As an old man in the village drew her hand on the rock and spoke slowly in English, "I am not a guest. I am the new blood of this mountain." Clara turned away to hide her tears, not out of weakness, but because it had been so long since anyone had considered her a part of any place. She planted corn by the stream. She taught children English on a piece of stone with letters carved into it. And in the evenings, when the sun set behind the mountains and the fire crackled, she leaned against Taza, her hand clasped in his, silent and full of voices. Clara bent down, her fingers gently scratching the soil by the stream, each handful as soft as sand. Spring had touched the ravine where they lived, bringing with it warm winds and the heady scent of herbs. In her hand were tiny seeds of wildflowers, unplanted, unchosen, yet still growing resilient, radiant in the wilderness. She planted each cluster of flowers as if replanting herself. No longer the girl who was assigned to an Apache as a debt to be paid. No longer the one who lived in the shadow of prejudice, despised by her father, scolded by her stepmother, laughed at by her neighbors. Every flower seed sown today is a slap in the face of the past, a declaration to the world, "I am here. I survived. I chose myself." Taza sat a few feet away, looking at Clara, his gaze like a mountain, steady, wordless. In his hands he held an old blanket, the wool frayed at the edges, the color of earth faded by the sun. The same blanket he had given her the night they first met. No words, no promises, just an act of kindness in a world without compassion. Now he wrapped it around her shoulders as gently as if embracing all the old pain she had tried to forget. Clara looked up at him, her hair dark with sunlight, the lines at the corners of her eyes not from age but from what he had witnessed, war loss, prejudice, and love from unexpected places. Taza said, his voice hoarse like the wind blowing through a pine forest, "No one will ever give you away again. No one else. No father, no soldier, no town, no piece of paper will decide her fate. Clara has been given back to herself." She leaned against his chest, eyes closed, silent. The early summer wind blew by carrying the scent of newly blooming wildflowers. Purple, yellow, and white petals began to bloom on the once despised ground. They didn't need anyone to tell them they were beautiful. They just needed to live. And so does Clara. Not all wars end with bullets. Some end with a woman putting flowers in the ground and deciding, "I belong here. No one will take me away." Clara took back her life with the rebellion of a rejected heart, and won not by forgiving, but by refusing to give in. If you believe that value is not in the eyes of others, but in your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to continue telling stories of the West, where there is still fire, love, and women who refuse to be forgotten. A falcon flew across the sky, its shadow skimming the ground before disappearing behind the rocks. Clara looked up, still brushing the dirt from her talons. Her eyes held something that was no longer melancholy nor quite peaceful, but alert. This place, a rugged stretch of land between forest and mountain, far from any white man's map, became Clara's second home. There were no fences, no churches, no preaching, just people living together in truth and patience. She learned to live like the Apaches, not to become one, but to understand that there were other ways of being than what she had been taught. She learned to listen to the wind before the rain, to read deer tracks on the ground, to distinguish between the stomping of human feet and that of wild animals. She learned to hunt not for the sake of killing, to cook not for the sake of filling her stomach, but to understand that survival was a form of respect. Every night, as Taza told his stories in slow, measured tones, Clara not only listened, but also remembered. Not because of the words, but because of the way he used his gestures, his eyes, his silence to convey what so many white people had never done: listen without judgment. And one evening by the fire, when the Apache children fell asleep together, while the old aunt sat smoking a cigarette and weaving a net in the dark, Taza reached out and gently touched Clara's cheek where a soldier had slapped her, and asked, "Do you regret it?" Clara was silent. Not because of the question, but because she realized it had been a long time since anyone had asked her anything with such sincerity. She smiled softly, the night wind blowing her loose hair. "I used to think I was the one left behind. Now I know I am the one who survived. I have no regrets. I only regret that I did not rebel sooner." Taza nodded, as if hearing something greater than words. And then Clara continued, her voice as small as the wind passing over the surface of a stream. "I will teach the girls here how to defend themselves. Not with guns, but with eyes that don't look down. I will tell them about an Apache man who treated an abandoned girl like she was a treasure. I will tell them about me."